Dear colleagues, good afternoon. I am happy to see you in the Bank of Russia. We are beginning the press conference by the Bank of Russia Governor, Mrs. Elvira Nabiullina. And to begin with, traditionally, we will hear a statement by the Governor following the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today, the Bank of Russia Board of Directors decided to reduce the key rate to 9% per annum. Let me set out further detailed factors that were central to our decision. First, inflation has virtually been at target level since the start of the year 2017. It is estimated at 4.2% as of 13th of June. Price movements are increasingly homogeneous across various regions and commodity groups. This suggests that the slowdown in inflation has become more sustainable. This trend is confirmed by core inflation data, more resilient to the impact of one-off factors. Core inflation was 3.8% in May. A recovery in consumption is becoming progressively more visible. Households are moving to realize deferred demand for durable goods, household appliances, and cars. Importantly, households are largely increasing their spending from current incomes rather than from the accumulated savings or credit. This is enabled by the moderately tight monetary conditions. Consumer demand continues to exert a disinflationary effect. Households have nonetheless been saving less out of their current incomes. This is evidenced by a slew of data, including those indicating slower growing deposits. At this point in time, this is understood to be a natural trend considering the ongoing economic recovery. We intend to watch these developments carefully, given the potential inflation risks involved. Second, low inflation expectations help us anchor inflation close to the target level. As regards households, their inflation expectations touched a new record low in May. However, they are still heightened at 10.3%. Analysts expect on target 4% inflation in both 2017 and 2018. According to short-term surveys of companies regularly conducted by the Bank of Russia, corporate inflation expectations are also down, yet they are invariably heightened. Households' inflation expectations have yet to show a sustainable downward trend. The way households tend to perceive inflation is determined by, beyond current price movements, price growth over the previous months or even years. This is why we are now increasingly focused on the average annual inflation level for the past 12 months. This value is calculated as an average of the 12 recent annual inflation indicators. This is currently 5.6%. This is to say, inflation having closed in on 4% is seen as an early accomplishment which is yet to demonstrate its sustainability. As inflation stays close to 4% every next month, the average annual inflation reading will be moving close to this level. It is only then at this point in time that we could say that our inflation is truly as low as 4%. Beyond overall price movements, household inflation expectations are impacted by price fluctuations in individual commodity groups. These are primarily food prices, with their inherently higher volatility, and this impact is asymmetrical in nature. Households tend to take notice of growth in prices more than their decline. Lower imports in the food consumer basket help reduce the exchange rate effect on prices. Yet, as import substitution unfolds, intra-year price fluctuations may intensify given the expressed seasonality of the Russian agricultural production. Surges in food inflation are most heavily felt by consumers and could undermine the sustainability of the trend towards lower inflation expectations. This is the area where additional government support is needed to develop the appropriate infrastructure, principally to provide for transportation, storage, processing and sale of agricultural products in order to reduce seasonal price volatility. Third, the pace of economic recovery has somewhat exceeded our expectations. However, the medium-term outlook for economic growth remains unchanged. Rostat's data suggests that annual GDP growth accelerated in the first quarter. The increase in industrial production and rebounding investment continued. The number of regions displaying production growth increased compared to last year. We expect GDP to grow 1.3 to 1.8% this year. This projection is slightly above the previous baseline forecast. However, we still consider the oil price to stand at $50 a barrel in 2017, given the current price movements and the oil market outlook. The reason behind the upward revision of GDP projections is somewhat faster than expected economic rebounding since the start of the year, which came along with improving business sentiment. We still assume that the oil price will draw back to roughly 40% a barrel in 2018-19. We do not expect it to considerably affect economic growth, given that the economy has already largely adjusted to low oil prices. As for the balance of payments, we forecast the current account to stay in positive territory at about 1 to 2% of GDP. Amid the floating exchange rate regime, capital outflow and current account movements will be mutually balanced depending on changes in the international reserves. Our baseline scenario provides for medium-term economic growth of about 2%. Given the structural constraints, growth prospects will increase as the government's structural policy is implemented. We will be able to consider their impact upon our forecasts when specific decisions are taken. Fourth, medium-term inflation risks remain in place. They are as follows. The external economic situation will likely remain unstable, as confirmed by the volatility of oil prices. We do not rule out that oil production in the US will grow, and other countries, which are not parties to the agreement, will expand their supplies to the global market. Demand-side risks are also in place. They result from a likely slowdown in the Chinese economy, as well as the development of energy-efficient technologies and alternative energy sources. As before, our press release traditionally lists another two risk sources: the inertia of inflation expectations, which I've already mentioned, and possible fiscal policy revisions. However, new inflation risks have recently become more evident. We take into account that increasing consumption and lower propensity to save are natural at this stage. Inflation risks will grow if these processes unfold too fast and outpace the expansion of production. Then inflationary pressure will increase both on domestically produced and imported goods. This will result, among other things, from the exchange rate movements, given that the increased consumption will largely be met through imports. Unemployment indicators have been relatively low in recent years, even as production decreased. Joblessness is in decline. Some segments are already seeing labor shortages. Their aggravation may have two effects, as we believe. The direct one is the productivity of labor lagging behind the wage growth. The indirect effect is a decline in growth potential due to the impossibility of attracting required skill sets to expand production and set up new businesses. In order to constrain these risks, we need not only monetary, but also structural policy measures. And to conclude, I would like to reiterate that inflation slowed down to roughly 4% is only the first, though a very important, step towards ensuring price stability. At this stage, our objective is to anchor inflation close to this level, push inflation expectations further downwards, and make them less responsive to unfavorable factors and risks. It is important that we could build confidence of all economic actors in our capability to anchor inflation close to the 4% target for a long period of time. Therefore, our approach to key rate cuts will remain balanced and prudent. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm ready to answer your questions. Dear colleagues, please do not forget to identify yourselves and your agency. Tatiana, please. Tatiana Chupasova. Tatiana Chupasova, Interfax Agency. I have two questions. The first is related to the previous press release issued by the central bank in April, which stated that the rate reduction is taking place in accordance with the expectations, large-scale expectations that the central bank is putting in, but the central bank didn't announce any sort of its guidance. And so my question is, could you share it with us towards the end of the year? What is the potential of the rate reduction may be there? And does the central bank plan to publish its outlook, long-term outlook, in terms of the way the key rates are going to evolve like the other national central banks do? My second question is because of the Fed rate increase, some experts believe that this may reduce the attraction of the carry trade operations in some of the emerging economies. And do you, because of that, see any risks for Russia, and specifically the risks of the ruble rate further weakening? Thank you very much. As to the publication of our forecast about the rate evolution, not all of the central banks actually do that, although some do, and we're currently discussing this possibility. But to our mind, before one is to start disclosing such outlooks, be those midterm or long-term, with certain intervals, we need to undertake a certain information work and preparation in order for this forecast not to be treated as a certain rigid commitment on the part of the central bank that is the range that we should be staying in, because our decision about the rates are made upon the analysis of the current environment and the expectations, which may change because life is changing, and therefore, to our mind, before we publish anything like that, we need to prepare the public opinion to receive such an outlook. So this is what we're working on right now. Now, as far as the Fed raised rate is concerned, first we see that the Russian market response was quite moderate, although as a background the oil price went down. There was such a modest and hazarded response similarly to the previous Fed decision to raise the rate. Now, as far as the possible effect upon the carry trade volumes and the potential effect upon the ruble exchange rate are concerned, first of all, yes, indeed, we have witnessed a certain gain in terms of the carry trade activity. It reached the peak in March. In April, it went down. Currently, we do not see any major fluctuations. On the contrary, the non-residents gradually moving out of the ruble, and so there are no major movements. And the accumulated carry trade, all in all, is not a huge one. If one is to take a look at the non-residents investments and the subsidiaries owned by non-residents through the organized markets in corporate bonds and government treasuries, this is about $7 billion US, which is, principally speaking, insignificant compared to the size of the currency market. We are not expecting there to be any major changes which may lead to any dramatic exchange rate changes. Colleagues, Olga, please. Olga Tanas, Bloomberg. If I may, also a few questions. Towards the end of the release, you put in a phrase which you haven't used for quite some time. Taking into account these factors, there will be a need to maintain a moderately rigid monetary conditions for a long period of time. Does it mean that you are currently expecting that this is going to take longer than just a year and a half or two, which you referred to previously? or for a certain time frame. And if at all possible, currently the United States are discussing strengthening sanctions against Russia, and amongst other things, sovereign debt is mentioned there as well. Because of that, do you foresee any risks to the Russia's financial markets, the debt market specifically, because the share of non-resident is too high? And my third question, if I may, is about the possibility for the Bank of Russia to resume its replenishment of reserve, because you've been always saying that in order to do so, you need to reach the inflation of 4%, and the market has to be stable financially. These conditions, principally speaking, are already around. Would you be able to start replenishing your reserves this year, please? Thank you. Well, even if in our press releases we not always mention the fact that we are maintaining a moderately tough fiscal and monetary policy, we are mentioning it almost everywhere in our presentation, because we believe that at the current stage we ought to maintain this moderately tough fiscal policy, which will be maintained even against the key rate going down. We are of an opinion that for a certain period of time we should be in a position to maintain this moderate toughness. Just to exactly state how long it's going to take, a year and a half or 2 years, more or less, is impossible to give you a precise date. Why? Because in many ways, to a larger extent I would say, it depends upon how quickly we are to reduce inflation expectations and, most importantly, fix them. Once we're convinced that they are at a stable level and the inflationary expectations aren't going to change dramatically, in case there are certain temporary shocks, then we will be in a position to much quicker switch over to the level of the neutral rate, which we also define the real rate as 2.5, 2.75. If in nominal terms against the inflation of 4%, this is 6.5, 6.75. But to our mind, this is something that may require several years for us to introduce this kind of a policy. But at the same time, we do not rule out that the rate is going to gradually go down, because right now our real rate, our key rate, is above than the neutral one. Now, in as far as further sanctions are concerned, we do not see a major effect from further sanctions upon the financial market. And by the way, the effect from the previously introduced sanctions, we believe, has been completely almost exhausted. Now, as far as the possible effect over the banking sector is concerned, it is anticipated that the terms will change in terms of the time frame for banking investments from 30 days down to 14 days. We don't see any major risk for the banking system here. As far as the debt is concerned, it is not yet clear, not easy to understand whether anything is expected, but we believe that if it affects new investments into the Russian treasuries, I don't believe this is going to be a big problem for the Minister of Finance and for the economy in general, because we do not entertain any major plans to grow government debt, generally speaking. And there are investors who are interested in this particular debt because it is attractive. So if all of a sudden there is a possibility to prohibit holding treasury portfolio, divestitures are going to bring in losses for the companies who in the first place invested in it, and so the American companies will have to sell it for a song. And so I believe that the Russian market players in this case would be very much keen on buying into these assets. And as far as a possible increase of our reserves is concerned, let me repeat it again. We believe that we've got enough reserves on all possible counts, but it would have been useful to strengthen our safety cushion in favorable environment and accumulate gold and hard currency reserves. And we do confirm the principles that we are not going to do it to the detriment without subjecting our 4% inflation target to risk. And our 4% inflation target is not just to achieve it as a one-off effort, but to maintain it at this level for a long period. So we cannot say that we have fully achieved our inflation target just yet. As far as the financial markets are concerned, it is true that they're quite stable, but nevertheless, in my presentation, I mentioned it. We do identify midterm risks, amongst other things, related to the oil price environment. We need to take it into account. For this year, we consider the possibility to start such acquisitions as a low probability, and in our base scenario do not envisage additional replenishment of our reserves, apart from what the Minister of Finance is currently doing. Colleagues, please, Gulnara. Gulnara Vahitova, RIA Novosti. Elvira Sahibzadovna, I have the following questions about today's board meeting. I wanted to ask you whether there was a decision to reduce the key rate by 0.25, a unanimous one. Another question is also about the board meeting. Didn't you discuss changing the target form, because it was mentioned that possibly at today's board meeting some kind of a new format is going to be discussed without changing the target level, which is 4%? And another question more specifically about the GDP indicator. Today you stated that you raised the outlook for 2017. Recently, the head of the Ministry of Economy stated that 2% GDP growth is something that we could expect to achieve already by autumn. So what the central bank has in terms of its outlook for GDP growth for the third quarter? Thank you very much. The decision on today's rate reduction was a unanimous one. We did not debate changing the format of our target, although there is a topic like that and we are discussing it in a working order, because the example of many countries show that targets are being defined as a specific point, sometimes as a certain range. And so we believe that we should not define the range just yet unless we reach a stable 4% target. But nevertheless, we are all aware that the inflation cannot be there, every day, every week, every month. 4% is going to be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. And so it's not the issue of redefining the target, because I believe this is secondary, but the primary issue, whether one should and how one should respond with the fiscal measures to such deviations, and what kind of deviations should be considered as the reason to respond to it, because such deviations could be significant but of a short-term nature. Whenever we see that a shocking factor whereby prices dramatically change for some kind of a commodity, and we can see that the shock is over, and most probably the prices will rebound to the previous level, and there are not going to be any secondary effect of the inflationary expectations, that it won't really flow out to cover a broader group of commodities, then the fiscal policy shouldn't respond in any way. However, if one-off shocks do bring about durable deviations from the target, I believe that we should include and launch the fiscal policy measures. So it is important for us to discuss this kind of possibility to react, because we are maintaining the target, and so we should try and understand how to respond to such deviations, to their size and to their natures, and that is what we're going to discuss. As far as the GDP is concerned, indeed, we have slightly notched up our outlook, although it remains a little bit lower than what the Minister of Economy had, and for the third quarter, Igor Alexandrovich will prompt me how much it is, approximately 1.3. Thank you. Colleagues, please. Margarita. Good afternoon. Margarita Shapilevsky, TASS Agency. Elvira Nabiullina, could you please tell me, in your recent announcement, the experts by the central bank stated that the bad weather may produce a short-term negative effect over inflation. We currently see that we are living through an anomaly, poor weather like June, and this effect, could it be more evident because of that? And my second question, the data about the capital outflow, now since you have reconsidered your expectations, are you changing your outlook? Well, thank you very much for the question about the bad weather. We usually note it as a traditional risk amongst the risks related to the crop yield, and so the seasonality and the prices related to the crop. Certainly something that we are concerned with. So principally, one should try and reduce the seasonal effect. And we do see the way it happens in some commodity groups where you have some greenhouse businesses developing. There you see more stable pricing for the products. So once again, I should remind you that it is very important to develop the logistics in agriculture to ensure price stability. And as far as the current year is concerned, generally, it is yet difficult for us to say the way the bad weather may impact, sort of whether it should affect the crop yield or it will be just a deferred seasonality, that the crop is going to be gathered later, but in the same volumes. It is premature to make conclusions, but many experts are saying that there will be a seasonal shift in place. Nevertheless, we are taking these risks into account when we make decisions, and this is something I mentioned in the category of short-term risks. As far as the capital flows are concerned, here it is important to talk about capital flows as a balancing line item as far as the current account is concerned, because we have a floating exchange rate. We should take into account the changes in the golden currency reserves, and then the current account saldo should be balanced by the capital outflow. And many countries who have a strong position in exports and have a strong current account, as a rule, they also enjoy a large size of the so-called capital outflow. And this is what we see through the example of Germany, Canada, Norway. Capital outflow should be distinguished from the dubious capital outflow. But nevertheless, the data we have on capital outflow are as follows: that it will be about 16 it will be for 2017 about 10 billion. Am I correct in stating it? Yes, 37 will be in 2017, 14 our expectation for 2017, and 8 in 2019, but a lot will depend upon the current account balance. Yes, colleagues, Elena, please. Elena Fabricna, Reuters. I also have a question about the current account, because many analysts expect that it will be negative in June because of the dividend payments. Do you expect any risks here for the ruble exchange rate? And my second question, Mr. Volodin proposed to the central bank to submit a request to the Federal Reserve about the state of the American economy, because the bigger part of the reserves are invested into US dollars. So are you going to follow his advice? And generally speaking, have you ever had any consultations with the Federal Reserve about the safety of your investments in US dollars in Russia? Thank you. Well, the current account is not a continuous one, because it has a strong seasonality, because, in Q1 it is stronger and then it weakens slightly afterwards. So we rather should be talking about a certain annual value in terms of what the current account will be. Based on our expectations, it will remain positive throughout all of the next 3 years, although its volumes will gradually reduce. For this year, we expect the current account to be about 37% positive, and then 14.8%. Now, in as far as our reserves are concerned, I don't remember having ever received such a query for the central bank to get in touch with the Fed. But the principle of the safety of the golden currency reserves is a priority principle, and we undoubtedly make all of our decisions based on the principle of the safety and security of such reserves, both in terms of the currencies that we have and the overall structure of such reserves. So all of the information that we need to make our decisions is what we have in our possession. Colleagues, please. Alexandra. Good afternoon, Alexandra Suvorova, Russia 24. Elvira Nabiullina, we wanted to speak about the license revocations. Recently, there has been some quiet. So can one say that as of today, the banking system is stable? Well, today we're having this press conference about the fiscal policy, but if there is such a question, let me answer. We are going to continue our policy of improving the state of the banking system, because we do still identify problems here, which are not of the systemic nature, because even those licenses which were previously revoked, they touched upon not a big amount of banking assets, but nevertheless, an existence of such weak players is definitely detrimental to the whole of the financial system, reduces the credibility to it. So we will pursue this policy at the kind of pace which will be the result of the real state of the financial institutions. We will definitely be changing regulation, and will be combating the risks we see as well as the new ones which may appear. We will continue it. Colleagues, please, your questions. Olga? Yes. If I may, could you be more specific? In your March update, you had 12 billion in terms of the capital outflow. Now it's 37, triple growth. Where does it come from? As I previously mentioned, this value is very much prognostic and is susceptible to fluctuations, and that is because of further update in terms of our expectation for the current account picture, which we've slightly changed because our exports grew a little bit as well as imports. So these have been reflected in a balancing line item of a capital outflow. We also took into account the replenishment of the reserves by the Minister of Finance and the return of the currency financing. Colleagues, please. Elena. Good afternoon, RIA Novosti Agency, Elena Medvedevna. Elvira Sahibzadovna, are you going to change your expectation in terms of the profitability of the banking sector due to the fact that it continues to show a high rate of increase, and also in terms of the lending? Have you revisited your expectation towards a more active level? And my second question, if I may, it's been for some time that we've been expecting to see who will be put in charge of the senior manager in the institution which is improving the stability of the banking sector. Well, we are not expecting measures to cyanide banks to increase in terms of numbers, because we would definitely enjoy that to be of a lesser import. But we will announce our decision once it is made. But right now, the management company, we do everything in order for it to be fully ready to participate in such measures if this decision is felt as necessary to be made. As far as the situation in the banking sector is concerned, indeed, the banking sector is stable. It recovers its performance and its profitability. In nominal terms, this profitability is approximately conforms to 2013 level nominally. Let me underscore, because we had a big inflation then, so in real term it remains a little bit less than what we had in 2013. And by the way, let me remind you that the profit of non-financial institutions throughout all these years has been growing. It didn't plummet the way it plummeted in the banking sector, fourfold, fivefold, and then it was climbing back again. The banking sector profitability, why this indicator is important? Because this is a source of capital, while capital is the basis for a greater lending activity. And so today there is a certain reserve in the banking system to grow lending. There is profit in place which may grow capital as well as may grow this reserve to activate lending. The core issue in our mind is the issue of the borrower's risks, because we can see that the banks quite justifiably begin to become more active in lending to reliable borrowers, and we do support the kind of an approach when lending has to be a quality performance, that debt should not grow. And we should, the banking system should support effective and efficient projects and business operations which are appearing these days. Our overall expectation in terms of the lending in the banking sector, we don't change it at about 5 to 7% this year. Colleagues, please. Dmitry. Dmitry Batenko, Kommersant newspaper. I've got one question. What are the expectations in terms of changing the credit rating within the 3-year time frame? And what may change because of a potential, growing of the credit rating in your outlook as well? Well, honestly speaking, we didn't introduce any changes. We didn't take into account changes of a credit rating in our forecasts. Principally speaking, we've been quite conservative towards all of the performance indicators, you see. But if the rating is raised, and I believe there are reasons for it to happen, then this overall may improve the investment attraction of the Russian assets and the ruble. In any case, I think that if it is happening, that will happen in a gradual way, and that will be a positive change for the Russian economy. Colleagues, please. Tatiana. You mentioned that you keep your outlook in terms of the lending activity growth of 5-7%, but what's your expectation in terms of the deposit growth, considering the fact that the traction in that as the Q rate is going down and the interest rates in the economy follow suit, and there are other alternative sources like the Treasury, for the mass consumer, and so what do you think? Well, we do believe that the rate of the deposit growth are going down, and they may be lower than the lending growth. I will put it this way, 2 to 4, maybe %. But at the same time, what is important that in the meantime, the real deposit rates remain in the positive area, and in our minds, the deposits are attractive to consumers. And as I stated, that by way of the risk assessment, we are watching the deposit rate dynamics and the extent to which it might affect the household's propensity to save. And the banks are monitoring this as well, because this is a very good base for their liability monitoring, and they would hardly be reducing the deposit rate to such an extent that it would lead to the reduction of their deposit base, because they are not interested in it at all. Colleagues, please. Dmitry, haven't had a chance. Yes. Dmitry Polyansky, RNS Agency. In the financial review of the first quarter, the regulators stated that it may consider further improvement of the DKP instrument because of a strengthening of the non-credit financial institutions. What are the instruments that you mean by this, and how are they going to be improved, and within which period of time that could be applied? Thank you. Well, this is more of a theoretical objective for a longer period of time, because we're always trying to improve our instrument set, although in our mind the whole line of the instruments of the fiscal measures and policies is what we already have, and that enables us to achieve the fiscal targets, and the transmission mechanism works quite effectively for our structures and for the financial structure of this country's economy, if I may put it this way. But the role of the non-financial institutions is growing. We are currently debating the long-term outlook, whether we need to change anything and to what extent. We're not yet ready to be specifics, particularly there's no decision yet about it. Alex, please. Alex Winning, Reuters Agency. I wanted to ask you whether the probability of a fiscal laxening in your fiscal policy is going to fall into any interval of pause, and do you anticipate anything like that towards the end of the year? Yes, the pauses we do allow for, if the risks manifests themselves, the one that I've spoken about, we don't have any predetermination in terms of the step, whether it should be 0.25 or 0.5, and we also do allow for making intervals, and not for one board meeting, if the risk assessments, specifically the midterm risk assessments, points to the probability of them happening is there. But looking at the current period, there's no probability just yet. It will remain at the same level. Colleagues, Gulnara, please. First Deputy Governor Yudaeva, in the beginning of July, stated that the central bank is working on a new macroprudential stress test for major banks. So could you please explain where the need for it comes from, and does the central bank expect any macroeconomic shocks to happen, and whether any indicators have been defined in terms of them being the points of monitoring of the banks? Well, you know that we already have the banks being stress tested individually, not only the banks, because in as far as non-government pension funds, we launched this. It's normal exercise to do stress testing individually, and now we are raising the issue of stress testing the whole of the financial system. Why? Because it's the issue of financial stability, which is also the authority of the central bank, because that represents systemic risks. And so it's not enough to undergo individual stress tests, because we need to take a look if any shocks happen. We need to look into what kind of intra-sectoral distribution they may have, considering the links between different financial institutions, which we know are very close sometimes. And in order to be able to expose the vulnerabilities, and if need be, to apply macroprudential measures in order not to allow for systemic shocks. This is a sort of a preventive work in order to avoid systemic risks happening. Colleagues, please. Our time is gradually coming up, so the last couple of questions. Olga, please. Could you please specify? In April, there was a statement that the overall potential of the fiscal policy laxening didn't change. So as of June, does your expectation remain, or the potential of, the scale of lowering of it has changed? No, it hasn't changed. It has not changed. Dear colleagues, and the last question, please. If there is one? No, there isn't. Thank you very much. Thank you.